Hello everybody, T.D.F.M here, and welcome back to yet another episode of T.D.F.M lore. Back in the tub again. Today's date is March 23rd of 2026 at 6:36 a.m. It's 6 o'clock in the morning, just like the other ring lore video I filmed previously on March 14th or whatever the date was when I filmed that. But you know. So, in today's episode of TDFM Lore, I want to talk about how I am pretty much been institutionalized by the system. And the reason why I say this is actually because from a very young age, I was locked up. The first I went to juvie jail, I was only 12 years old. And from the time I was 12 to 17, I was locked up somewhere that was either juvie, a mental ward, a mental hospital, or an RTF, which stands for Residential Treatment Facility, which is pretty much like a placement they stick you in that has a little bit more privileges than a mental hospital or whatever, but it's pretty much still the same thing. And you are absolutely confined when you're there. Now, it wasn't consecutive, from 12 to 17. There was a few gaps here and there where I was free, but at some point during my life, from 12 years old to 17 years old, I again was locked up somewhere that was either East Ferry or juvie, which is the name of the juvie jail in the Buffalo, New York area, or a mental ward, or a mental hospital, or an RTF, like Baker RTF or Hillside RTF. And this accustomed me to a very young age to become, institutionalized. When I went to juvie for the first time when I was 12, I absolutely hated being there. I couldn't stand it. I wanted to leave. And very shortly later, I did leave. And that wasn't that bad. I mean, it was kind of bad because I was 12 years old, and here I am in a literal little jail pod with a gray jail jumpsuit on in a cell, sleeping in a cell at night. Even when I went to court, I was transported in a jail van and shackled and held in another cell, when that happened. So that's, not a good thing to experience when you're only 12 years old. There's adults, full-blown grown men, who have never even been to jail before in their life, and here I am going to jail at only 12. A very adult situation at a very young age. But, I hated being there, wanted to leave. Eventually, I was let out after a week of being there, which felt like a long time because I was only 12. And then when I was 13, I went to my first mental ward for a week. Fucking itching. My shit's itching for some reason, annoying. But when I went to my first mental ward when I was 13. And I also, again, hated being there, wanted to leave, wanted to get out. I did my first significant amount of time locked up from freshly 14 to 15, nearly 16, so just under 2 years. From freshly 14 and just under 16. So 15, almost 16, so just under 2 years. And I was at a mental ward for 2 months, then I was at CPC, which is a children's psychiatric hospital in West Seneca, New York, for 4 or 5 months. And then I went to a Baker RTF, Baker Victory Services RTF, for just under a year and a half. So all in all, that time put together into one, just under 2 years. And when I first went to the first mental ward there, for those 2 months, because I went from place to place directly, from the mental ward, the CPC, to Baker, consecutively from place to place. When I was in the mental ward, Those first 2 months, it was horrible. It was absolute psychological torture, especially at such a young age, freshly 14 years old. I absolutely hated it. I couldn't stand it. I was like being driven like up the wall just because I wanted to leave so fucking bad more than anything. And then eventually, after being there for 2 months, I was released from there and immediately taken to another place, CPC, which is a children's psychiatric hospital in West Seneca, for like 4 or 5 months. And once I got there, I was a little bit more accustomed to being locked up at that point, but I still wanted to leave. And eventually I went from CPC to Baker. And when I first got to Baker, again, I didn't like it. I wanted to leave, but at Baker specifically, I was there for like just under a year and a half. From when I got to Baker to when I got released from Baker, and then came back home. So all that time, plus all the previous time spent at the mental ward and also the mental hospital, CPC before, which was like just under 6 months or something like that, before I was at Baker, that time put together, gradually me being at Baker, it got to a point where the desire to leave slowly started to fade away. It got to a point where I was just so messed up from being locked up so long, and I wanted to leave so badly for so long at that point, that the desire to leave started to fade. It started to get to a point where being locked up to me was just my normal. I stopped thinking about getting out. I stopped thinking about going home. Me just being there became my normal. Like, I just accepted pretty much at that point that this was just my life. It's not like my life was on the outside and I'm being infringed upon that by being here. It said, no, this is my life. That is the mentality I started to develop after being locked up for so long and having my desire to leave be corroded over such a long period of time, that it just became my normal. I stopped wanting to leave. I didn't really think about leaving. It just became very normal everyday thing to be on this systematic routine of having a guaranteed, housing over my head, from going to school, because you had to fucking go to school while you're at all these places still, which made it kind of worse than adult jail, because at least you don't have to go to fucking school still at, adult jail or prison. So it actually was kind of worse in that way, in particular. And it just became very normal to me to get the free housing, to go to school, to get 3 meals a day, to have our little stupid rec, to, have access to a bathroom guaranteed and a shower, and to go to sleep at a certain time and then wake up the next day and do the same thing. This also made me aggressive as well, because these places I was in, these places I was being forced to be against my will, were like, again, they were like jail or prison. And just like someone in jail or prison is locked in with people who aren't necessarily the best people, and that pretty much forces them to be aggressive in order just to survive and thrive in those environments. That's exactly what these places did to me. It made me aggressive because I was being involuntarily forced to be around people that could have been, scummy people or just had mental issues, but either way, there's still a potential threat if they perceive you as a vulnerable person. So I became aggressive. I learned the value of violence and aggression from a very young age because of these places. And it's ironic because, again, they're claiming to be helping or treating me, when in reality, that couldn't have been farther from the truth. They completely destroyed and ruined me mentally. They made me aggressive. They made me violent. They institutionalized me from a very young age. They made me become accustomed to being locked up and on a routine and getting this and that and that and this guaranteed. Things that you don't get in the real free world. In the real free adult world, you're expected to do everything on your own. Find your own place to live, get your own job, get your own food, do absolutely everything just by yourself. And this is why it's damaging to be confined somewhere like jail, like prison, like a mental facility, because it makes you become accustomed to the system there, to getting everything you need guaranteed. That's what you become accustomed to. That's not teaching someone to be independent. That's literally teaching them to be dependent. And that's why it's so detrimental to people just in general. And that's exactly what it did to me. Even now, at this point in my life, I don't really care if I go to jail or prison. I'm not afraid of going to jail or even prison, because I'm already so accustomed and I'm so used to being locked up at this point in my life that it would be no big deal for me. I went to jail when I was exactly 20, the adult jail, the holding center, county jail, and where I live downtown. Well, in the city I live next to, that's, the jail downtown. I went there for a couple of weeks and I honestly didn't care at all. It was just because I'm just so used to and accustomed to and familiar with being locked up at this point in my life that it is literally no longer a big deal to me. I didn't care at all. And I'm not saying that to sound tough or whatever, it's just I literally didn't. That is how my brain is now, because that's how they made me the fucking be. Right? I didn't even care. To me, at this point, jail or a mental facility is pretty much just free housing and free food. That's what it is to me at this point. And that's a really sad way for my brain to work. That is sad. Because you should want to be free and you should want to actually, do things in life that are actually enjoyable and meaningful, and not give a fuck that you're just being locked up against your will. But it's just, that's how I grew up. That's how I developed. From 12 to 17, I was locked up in places like juvie, mental ward, mental hospital, RTF. That's how they made me be. That is how I am, because that is how they made me to be. So, I hate to say it, but yeah, I pretty much am kind of institutionalized, because that's what that is. It just gets to a point where you've been locked up for so long that you stop giving a shit about being locked up. It just becomes your normal at that point. And that's pretty much exactly what happened to me. And those effects are still there even now. Again, don't really care if I go to jail or prison, because being locked up to me at this point is as familiar and as normal as can be, and it's pretty much just free housing and free food. I think about how when my grandmother eventually passes away, I'm probably just going to become homeless because I am so disabled and I can't function. And I almost kind of like the idea of going to prison. I watched some prison shorts on YouTube, and it's like, that seems like a good deal. Free guaranteed housing, free 3 guaranteed meals a day, a guaranteed place to sleep, a guaranteed access to a toilet, a shower, etc. You see what I mean? You don't get any of this on the street. You don't get any of that on the street. You're expected, again, to do absolutely everything on your own in the real free adult world. And that is unfortunately how my brain has been programmed to be by them. I wasn't born like that. Okay, I wasn't born like that. That's how they developed me. That's how they programmed me. That's how they made me to be, by locking me up and, yes, institutionalizing me from a very young age. And the negative effects that's going to have on me, I guess, for the rest of my life, to see jail or prison or confinement just in general as being normal to me, which unfortunately it pretty much is. See you on the next one.